the single most important document in the history of depth psychology, was hidden from the public for 95 years. Carl Jung began writing it in 1914 in the aftermath of his break with Sigmund Freud. He stopped working on it around 1930. He never released it. When he died in 1961, his family kept it sealed. It was only in 2009 when his heirs allowed the historian Sonu Shamdasani to translate and publish the manuscript that scholars finally read what was inside. And what they read forced a complete reappraisal of the man who gave us the word archetype. The book has a title. Jung called it Liber Novus, the New Book. In private, he referred to it simply as the Red Book, because of the heavy red leather binding he had specially commissioned. Inside the volume were hundreds of pages of text in calligraphic German script, written in the style of a medieval illuminated manuscript, decorated with painted mandalas, dragons, serpents, and human figures drawn in Jung's own hand. He worked on it in the same lakeside house, in Küsnacht, outside Zurich, where he saw patients during the day and turned in the evenings to something stranger. Vienna and Zurich, 1912. The collaboration between Jung and Freud was beginning its final collapse. Freud had treated him as a chosen successor, the figure who would carry psychoanalysis into the next generation. Then Jung published a book on the symbolism of myth that disagreed with Freud's theory of libido. The correspondence between them grew colder. The final letter in early 1913 was a clean and bitter break. They met one last time at a congress in Munich that September and never spoke again. For Jung, the loss was not only professional. He was in his late 30s. He had built his career on Freud's framework, and that framework was now closed to him. According to the Library of Congress exhibit on the Red Book, Jung described the period that followed as a confrontation with what he called the unconscious. He began to experience what he described as visions, waking dreams that came to him with the intensity and detail of real events. He was a trained psychiatrist who had spent years at the Bergholzli Hospital diagnosing patients with conditions much less like the one he now suspected in himself. He had to decide whether he was watching the early stages of his own psychosis or something else. He decided, instead, to write it down. That decision is the origin of the Red Book. Jung began keeping what he called the black books, plain notebooks, in which he recorded each vision as it came. He would later transcribe the most significant of these into the larger calligraphic Red Book, adding the images that emerged alongside the text. The technique he was developing did not yet have a name. He would later call it active imagination. The basic principle was this: when a vision or a figure rose into consciousness, instead of dismissing it or being overwhelmed by it, you allowed it to speak. You answered it. You took notes on the conversation. What he heard in those conversations became the seedbed for almost every major idea associated with his name. The first significant figure who appeared was an old man with white hair and the wings of a kingfisher. He called himself Philemon. According to the Philemon Foundation archive, Jung described Philemon as a being who represented insight he himself did not possess. Someone who taught him that thoughts could have a life of their own inside the mind. There was also a young girl named Salome who claimed to be blind. There was an old prophet named Elijah, who Jung came to associate with the figure of the wise old man. There was a serpent that wound around their conversations. There were descents into underworlds and ascents into starlight, and through it all, Jung was writing. He was also, during this same period, seeing patients during the day, raising 5 children, and serving briefly in the Swiss army as the First World War broke out across Europe. The Red Book was kept entirely private. His wife Emma knew about it. A small handful of close colleagues knew about it. Almost no one else did, even decades after he had become one of the most famous psychologists in the world. If the visions had stayed visions, they would be a footnote, the private spiritual exercises of an unusual man. What makes the Red Book matter to the history of ideas is that the figures inside it became the structure of Jung's later thought. The archetype of the wise old man is recognizably Philemon. The archetype of the anima draws from Salome. The concept of the self, the inner totality that Jung placed at the center of his model of the psyche, took shape through his dialogues with these inner figures, and through the mandala images he painted while the visions were still fresh. You are listening to the work of someone exploring vast ideas in private archives. If you are finding this kind of story interesting, there is more like it on the channel. And then he locked it away. By the 1920s and 1930s, Jung was internationally famous. His school of analytical psychology had drawn followers across Europe and America. He was lecturing at major universities. He had every professional incentive to publish the Red Book as a kind of grand revelation, the personal mythology behind his public theories. He did not. According to Britannica's biography of Jung, his stated reason for withholding the book was that he feared it would be misread. The visions were intimate. The language was archaic and ecstatic. The paintings were the work of an amateur. And the kind of experience the book described, direct contact with autonomous inner figures, was exactly the kind of material that academic psychiatry of the early 20th century would have classified as pathology. There may have been a deeper reason as well. The Red Book reads, in long stretches, less like a psychological case study and more like a piece of religious literature. There are passages that imitate the cadence of the King James Bible. There are sequences that resemble Gnostic Gospels or Hermetic alchemical texts. Jung had been raised in a household of Swiss Reformed pastors. His own father had lost his faith in his final years and died troubled. To present this material to the public would be to claim a kind of authority that Jung, in his role as a scientist of the mind, did not want to claim openly. So he kept it in a vault, literally. The original manuscript spent most of the 20th century in a Swiss bank, accessible only to a small circle of family members. His death in 1961 did not change this. His heirs continued the policy of restriction. Scholars who wanted to write about Jung's psychological theories had to do so without access to the document that, by Jung's own account, contained the foundation of those theories. For more than 4 decades, this was the situation. The change came slowly, beginning in the 1990s, when the historian Sonu Shamdasani persuaded members of the family that the manuscript needed to be made available. The Philemon Foundation, established in part to support this kind of scholarship, became involved. It took years of negotiation, transcription work, and translation by a team that included Mark Kybers and John Peck working alongside Shamdasani. The first edition was published by W. Norton in 2009. It was a large format facsimile, reproducing Jung's calligraphy and paintings, page by page, with the translated text running alongside. The publication transformed Jungian studies. Earlier generations of Jung scholars had been working from the published lectures, the case histories, the autobiography. They had been working from Jung's later, more polished accounts of his own ideas. With the Red Book available, it became possible to trace particular concepts back to particular visions, to see what archetype emerged from what dialogue with what inner figure. The work that had been treated as the source of his thinking was now, finally, in front of scholars who could read it. What you take from the Red Book depends on what you came to it for. A historian sees a primary document of European spiritual life in the first half of the 20th century. A clinician sees a long case study of someone using a structured, imaginative practice to integrate difficult psychological material. A reader of esoteric literature sees a Gnostic text that arrived too late to be canonical and too late to be ignored. Jung himself, late in life, described the Red Book as the source of everything that came afterward in his work, and said that the years he had spent on it were the most important of his life. He did not say it was the most important book he had written. He said it was the most important thing that had happened to him. The volume is still in print. The facsimile edition is in major research libraries. You can read it today in a way that no one outside Jung's immediate circle could read it for the first 95 years of its existence. The figures who walked through Jung's mind in the years after his break with Freud are now figures you can meet on the page, painted by the man who saw them in the language he chose to write them down. If stories of hidden manuscripts and the inner lives of the people who left them behind are the kind of thing that holds your attention, there is more of this work on the channel.